Okay, let's get going. So first, I want to welcome everyone to the closing plenary for the ABC workshops of 2022. And I want to remind everyone that we are being recorded. So by staying on, you're agreeing to be recorded. If there are any privacy concerns that you might have, feel free to keep your camera off and change your identifying title below your name or below your image. Next, I want to spend a minute and just acknowledge all of the folks that have been behind putting this week together. These are the organizing members of the Architecture Lobby Academia Working Group. And then I want to take a minute as well and recognize all of the facilitators that have helped put this week together with the individual workshops. It's been an incredible effort around the globe with a lot of really fantastic conversations happening over the past 6 or 7 days. So we'll cover this just as a kind of reminder about how these sessions are meant to work. So these are our Zoom etiquette guidelines. As long as there's a kind of discursive component to this, we ask that you turn your video on as long as you're able and comfortable. Reminders to take care of yourself. If you need to take breaks, take them. If you need to eat and drink, do so. And if you need to step away, you can also turn off your video, and that will give us an indicator that you are not participating in the moment. We ask that you add the pronouns to the part of your Zoom name if you're comfortable doing so. There's instructions for how to edit your name on the right hand of this slide. Respect the person who's speaking and keep chat to everyone in the chat box to a minimum. Mute your microphone when you're not speaking. And just to do a little demonstration of this, if you haven't already participated at this point, if you do have something to say or contribute, we ask that you type stack into the chat like I just did here, and that gives a kind of running account of the order people that are wanting to say something, and our moderators will call on you in the order that that stack was received. Then some guidelines for discussion. Please acknowledge, use, and respect people's pronouns. Use I statements. Don't assume that you're speaking for others. Listen very carefully to what others are saying. Across the board, assume good faith and positive intent. And respect the spirit of the progressive stack. So that's what we just talked about. The only exception to the stack is if you have a direct response to what someone is saying, and in which case you can type stack direct response into the progressive stack chat. Respect the workshop agenda and people's time. And then above all, in this exercise in particular, remember that this is democracy and it's a bit messy, and that's part of the process, and we're all embracing that. Okay, so let's get into what we're about to do today. This is what we kicked off with, and it was a reminder that these aren't classes, these are workshops. And these are workshops really intentionally, because we are seeing this particular moment in time as one that needs a lot of work, and we can't do it by ourselves. So we see this as a kind of coming together to identify the issues, methods, concerns, ways of organizing towards change in architecture education. So over this past week, a lot of issues have come up that we would like to keep building on. And today, the reason why we're gathering is to actually have a review of the material that we have covered, and to do a kind of pulse checking of what we've covered, so that we can also move forward from here. So this is a kind of funny moment where this is a closing plenary, but it's also a kicking off. And for this kicking off, we're basically welcoming you all to a typical meeting of the Architecture Lobby Academia Working Group. And we're going to be engaging you all in the process of taking the lessons from this past week and turning them into next steps. So the springboard for this is a series of sentences and statements that came out of the workshops that the facilitators have helped to put together. Earlier today, we met as a kind of small group to try and synthesize those into a kind of set of action items that we might start to build as a platform for changing architecture education. And the way that today's going to work is I'm doing this kickoff. I will be basically running the typing in the background. And this is my kind of cue to say that we're jumping to the next area. So everything that we're doing now is moving past 2022 and moving to the next phase. So I'm going to stop sharing at this point and share a different screen. Let's see if I can pull this one up. And I'm going to type into the chat a link to this document. So everyone now has access to this document. And over the next, let's say, hour and a half plus, we're basically going to be going through our synthesis of the learning outcomes that we've received. And like I said, we broke these down into 4 umbrella categories, identity being one, content being another, infrastructure being the third, and organizing being the fourth. And we just want to run by you all the different ways of kind of interpreting the learning outcomes that we have come up with, and let everyone join in the conversation of adding to these, clarifying these, and these become our kind of mission statement for moving into the years that come and become the things that the academia working group at the Architecture Lobby is working towards and hopefully working with you all on. So with that, I'm going to hand it off to Peggy, and she's going to cover the identity area of the conversation.
Thank you. And yet, just to reiterate, we didn't just go through the action items, but themes in which they were placed, which seemed important to cover. So these aren't point-by-point action items put under these categories. These are categories that were part of the discussion that we now were going to intersect with the action items, many of which could go into many of these different categories. So anyway, I'll just say, to start out with identity, a lot of the sessions had to do with what we're calling identity, which is to basically say who is in the studio, who's able to and actually brought to the table that is the studio. And a lot of that really has to do with a very, very direct question of who produces studio. We know that that's traditionally the studio teacher, but many of the sessions were emphasizing that this needs to be co-produced with the students. But also a lot of the discussions were how this needs to not just be a question of student empowerment, but also a question of who we are as faculty. Really, what is our identity? And who are the students, and do they feel comfortable bringing forward their identity as opposed to just being flattened as identified within the studio of so-and-so in the institution of blah, 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 that their own subjectivities, their own backgrounds are brought to it. But this then extends to the reviewers, that one needs to know who the reviewers are. They're not just brought in as experts with, some kind of mantle put on them and you stop asking questions, but then again, what they're bringing, why they're there. And of course, the community is part of this too. If we're speaking for the community or acting upon the community, that the community needs to be at that table. Then there was the issue of how might individual/collective subjectivities be understood and brought forward. Again, this maybe has to do with the kind of more fundamental question of, when we talk about who's brought to the table, of how do you understand yourself as a person who has something to say, who comes with certain backgrounds, whose ideologies are framing you, self-consciousness about those ideologies. How can those subjectivities at a profound level of you as architect, or you as architect citizen, or you just as a player in the world, a political person, and how is that understood and brought forward? Clearly part of this question is power in the studio, that certain certain subjects have more power than others. And instead of pretending that that's not the case, we need to acknowledge where and how they exist. And then we need to try and equalize those power dynamics. So it starts with transparency, but then it also ends with active changes to overcome those traditional set of roles and powers. Part of this also then is transparency about the content, the methods, the perspectives that are being brought to the people at the table. Again, this is just being very, very clear that we as faculty might have certain interests. I don't even want to say biases, but certain interests that are maybe not the ones that are number one in the syllabus, but nevertheless have to do with why they are willing to spend and want to spend this amount of time teaching this thing. But certainly on the other side, the students and their perspectives, and getting this again in the open. Part of this is also when we're kind of thinking about identities, subjectivities, you know, what does it mean to be an architect? How I perform as an architect? What does that even mean? To think about stretching that definition or thinking about its boundedness within a much larger context of politics, society, communities, neighborhoods. Yeah, so emphasizing the citizen architect and all of this. Part of this also is the issue of how are we going to, as teachers, teach better? It was pointed out that many of us who teach, most of us who teach have never been taught to teach, and we just recreate how we were taught. And so the issue of how we learn, the methods by which we learn to come out of our standard perpetuations of teaching methods. We need to learn to teach how to teach, and we also need to teach how to teach. There also is the issue of the inclusion of student expression. You know, this has to do with the ability to have the student feel like they're in a safe environment in order to express their doubts, their insecurities, their lack of knowledge, or their expertise that is not one that's appreciated already. And then also just part of this is making sure that non-architects are at the table in studio, that as long as we're talking to ourselves, we're perpetuating the problem of our exclusive elitism, and that non-architects too need to be part of the studio set of players, subjectivity, advocates, organizers. So thank you. So Jessica, I'll pass it on to you.
Thanks, Peggy. I'm going to be discussing content as one of these themes and categories that we identified. And I think it builds on what Peggy's discussion, or what she's been discussing with the WHO. This is about what is taught in the studio. And as we began to synthesize from these workshops, of course, there were overlaps and certain ideas such as content was something that Peggy had discussed as a point under identity. But this is really something that we saw expanding because so many of the workshops began to touch on what is taught in the studio, as well as how it is taught, the methods, pedagogy, and what those approaches are. So I think part of what this began to address and what we heard in many of the workshops was primarily how this content might be paced in the context of a studio, which tends to occupy most of the time for students, teachers, professors, as well as maybe to some degree administrators, but certainly those of us who are involved in architectural education. So there were several discussions around the documents that also that facilitate studio, and I think this is something that was brought into here. So rather than going point by point, I think the summary of this is we'll see a lot of ideas around politics, politicizing site analysis, for example, activism and organizing. Organizing broke out as its own category, as well as large scale categories such as business, economics, and capitalism. And we think that what this primarily touched on is how we understand various perspectives beyond, for example, just meeting the task of site analysis or surveying, right? How those processes become politicized. We started to find themes of community awareness and engagement. And certainly design build is something that is involved in this as well, because part of what I think in many of the discussions that came up is a respect for certainly construction labor and the relationships that we make with contractors, subcontractors, and others who are involved in the architecture, engineering, construction community. We also recognize specialization, expertise in allied disciplines. We had several facilitators who are not in architecture. And so it was really fantastic to see how allied disciplines began to weave into some of the conversations that we were having. Material sourcing, considering the environment and economics, of course, just thinking about the full development of a project was something that was fairly obvious and something that was unpacked in many of the workshops. And as I mentioned earlier on, many of the ways that the studios were unfolded are through something that's fairly ubiquitous, the syllabus, right? The project briefs that many of us put forward in the studio. So I think this came up in several of the workshops. What are the ethics? What's consent? How is this written into a syllabus that effectively could work as and many times does work as a contract in the studio setting? Strategies for rapid response and connecting to society, although broad, are questions of how we begin to structure and pace the studio. I want to come back to developing a curriculum around non-canonical and non-colonized thinking, because this was a theme that struck through many of the workshops. Certainly one of the first workshops in which we were looking at how to build networks around Indigenous scholars, for example, and to move, at first we had discussed this as non-Western thinking, but I think that there's various ways to approach this. So ultimately, what is taught in studio, of course, is the question, but certainly how we build up methods, the pedagogy around it, and certainly how we pace studios according to the content and how it's delivered to students, around students, building around students, faculty, how they become involved. And I think this is something that connects to many of the questions and aspects that Peggy was discussing about the who. With that, I will pass it on to infrastructure, Jean and Tessa.
Yeah, for infrastructure, I was realizing we never really defined what we meant by infrastructure. So this was kind of more, and I think it's a little bigger than institutional, because we're also talking about how project briefs come into studio. So who's fund and alternative ways of funding it. But other than that, we're thinking about the way we get certified, so schools, certification boards, how we get reviewers in, all of these things. And I think a lot of our points that we were finding overlapped with content, what has already gone over. So the main ones that I think were different were things like starting new institutions or creating more infrastructure and alternative infrastructure to support what people want to do within and perhaps without or outside of architecture. So a certification program or a school where we bring in more interdisciplinary teachings and service learning stuff than architecture already provides. And Tessa, do you want to add? I can go through points more, but if you have a synthesis.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose I think this was discussed a lot throughout the week of opportunities to maybe better share in common the resources for these kind of reimagined or alternative futures for architecture education and also for practice. And I mean, I'm personally quite interested in how we can, instead of constantly feeling like the value of the educational space is being, I guess, kind of challenged or misunderstood by practice, forcing practice to be a little bit, defending our relevancy, I suppose. I think particularly through these reimagined models in the kind of face of global challenges. But yeah, if you want to run through these, Jean, that sounds good.
Yeah, I was just trying to figure out how to get the Zoom side by side so I could read it better. Yeah, so how do we, action points would be things like how do we get the institutions to make changes? And those institutions could be the schools, and do we convince the faculty, or do we need to go through the administration and talk about licensing, figure out ways around or coexisting with licensing requirements to teach? Or do we not care about licensing requirements anymore? And can we convince schools, if that is something we want to do, to convince schools to require or offer classes that don't correspond or correlate or help with licensing requirements, but do help with the practice of architecture or with things that architect students, faculty care about. So that goes along with enabling true interdisciplinary stuff. So promoting maybe some environmental science workshops or classes or certifications, sharing knowledge, talking about open source stuff was a big thing. So creating a network of information or of people or sources to get the information you want that is outside of the traditional architectural infrastructure institutions. How do you influence the collateral institute, the professional institutions, if they even can be influenced, the state policy, cooperative models, that was a big one for us. Cooperative models of practice for architects. So how do we share, how do we gather, and how do we create sources of information for people? Oh, and then one was, there's a model, do we pay students to come to these schools or classes? Because there was they were doing that at Dark Matter University, and Kanambari was saying there was something like that at Barnard with high school students. Yeah, and then again, stuff enabling us to think of architecture and learning about architecture outside of the big A Western bias sort of concept of architecture, and deprofessionalizing the practice, or the actual practice, not the professionally licensed practice. That makes sense, like creating an alternative model, especially when people are already not they're choosing not to use architects for a lot of projects anyways. So empowering people to work without that license and still do what we think is architecture, what we care about with architecture. All right, did I miss anything? So I can pass it on to the organizing folk now.
Great, thank you, Jean. And as you can see in organizing, Andrea, is it possible to scroll up a little bit? Thank you. So myself and Tony will be covering this area, but with this sort of last theme, as you can see that the lists before are fairly granular, quite specific. And of course, there are kind of many overlaps, etc. But with this, we also wanted to remind you, as often we start, as Andrea said, this is exactly like one of the academic working group lobby, architecture lobby meeting. And we often start the sessions by asking, why are you here? And I think all of you are already here. All of you have already participated this week as facilitators, as participants, etc. And I think we hope that with this, we are already learning something about learning and teaching organizing. And I think that this is something that we want to come back to in this theme and think about the kind of larger frame that we are proposing about architecture beyond capitalism, as that's what you've all responded to. You gave us fantastic workshops covering quite a wide range of issues. And so that was really interesting to see. And I think with this, we want to think about how do we activate across all of the issues, quite specific ones, if I may add that, across these themes that we've already identified. And so with that, we want to think about, of course, this is around understanding political issues that are local, global, and if I may add one more, planetary at the same time. So I think we might want to start thinking about really kind of both kind of zooming in and out about the specificities of these local, global, and planetary issues, but also understanding that they are related, whether we see it or not, or how do we really specify. And so that's something that I think we really saw in quite a few workshops and the briefs that were already coming our way. And I think with that, we also, I think what's emerging are like, how do we now start thinking about, inventing strategies of resistance and also building solidarities for reform, change, and transformation architecture education, which is, we could say it's an easy task if we all put all our collective energies to it, if we wanted to. So this is, I think, really perhaps thinking about activism and organizing and what happened this week and what lessons are there to draw from this week, but also the other kind of forms of activism that the architecture lobby is engaged in. And how do we kind of build solidarities across some of these initiatives to think about this larger frame of architecture beyond capitalism, because we think that's possible. I think with this, I'm going to pass it on to Tony.
Kia ora tātou, whānau, greetings from Aotearoa, New Zealand. Yeah, I mean, this is the what next question, I think, which seems important to me. We remember that Marx said that the philosophers have only interpreted the world, and the point is to change it. I think this week of workshops has been exceptionally interesting for me and hopefully for others in raising a whole lot of issues, but we now have to decide what we're going to do with them. And the mantra of thinking globally and acting locally seems to me an appropriate one. So obviously the lobby itself and the academic caucus and the lobby is one way of continuing the organization to effect change, but it's not the only one. And I think in all of the local communities that you occupy, possibility exists to build discussion groups which will propose and initiate changes within your local environments. And I think that's the task for us going forward. And I think the lobby is a great forum for doing that, but it's not the only one. So that's, I think, the organizing bit as far as I'm concerned. Ronak, discussion.
Yeah, so I guess now it's time to kickstart the discussion. So yeah, basically you can just like in the stack, just maybe even suggest what we missed or what you want to add to maybe a previous workshop, or maybe proposing a future workshop, or just, just any sort of ideas that we can do to maybe make the next events work better. So
I can just add to that, not only thinking about the next set of ABC School, but thinking about with all of these topics and things that we've touched on, what is next for us and us as a group and us individually right within our own communities. So I'll put that out there too.
And a couple of things before we totally dive in. I will be kind of running the notes in the background, which means that I'm going to be the primary editor of the document, but everyone has editing capabilities. So if you all want to add something, like you see where I'm missing something or there are better ways of phrasing things, just highlight the text like that and add a note on the side with a comment that allows you all to include other perspectives in the document. And then to give a sense of how we've been talking about where these things go, we started imagining that there might be some sort of document of tenets or ethics that we might be adopting as a lobby. Those might then develop into direct action plans for making changes. And then even larger than that, actually starting to put together sort of speculative planning projects for ideal futures. So with those in mind, we can talk about these in order, out of order, etc. So jump on in there. Peggy.
This maybe doesn't need to be said, but it is the case that when we categorize like this and then kind of made subcategories, that we weren't primarily looking at the action items. And so I'm worried that some of you who really spend a lot of time doing your one sentence action items, like, I don't see my action item. That's part of what needs to happen now, is the interweaving of these more topical categories with action items that, again, could weave in different ways. So don't just raise your hand and say, my action item is not in there. Maybe you can put it within the context of these issues that we hope to discuss and expand on.
Tony?
Yes, all I wanted to say is that while this is the academic caucus that's put this summer school together, and we are talking a lot about what happens in the academy, studio practice extends beyond the academy into the practice community. And I would welcome any expressions that deal with practice rather than just the academy.
Natalie?
Hey, so I'm gonna come into the doc and add some stuff, some thoughts I had from the workshops I attended this week. But maybe just to start, kind of, for me, the way I'm thinking about this is like, I'm thinking about, okay, what were the workshops I attended this week? And from those conversations, what are tangible things that we can do, right? So that's kind of like in my head how I'm trying to like make this translation. And one of the workshops especially that I helped to moderate was with Epicturelli this week, with community design, community engaged design, and accountability. How can we maintain accountability? And that was definitely a workshop where it felt like 2 hours was not enough time. And it felt like we were all in a very, very intense discussion and almost debate, where the next step in the clear path forward wasn't clear yet, right? I think we all had kind of some different ideas as to how best to approach accountability within communities. And it's just, I think to me, it really illustrated like we need to be having these conversations more, right? Like that's the thing I walked away with. But like if we are, wow, like we're trying to like understand the basic concepts and make sure we're all using the same terminology here, and this should be something we were able to talk about, right, a little bit more easily, I think, So anyway, I wanted to say that I'm going to add in the identity section. I think I'll add in some thoughts and points that were my takeaways from that in particular, but I feel like the conversation around accountability within working with, the people who are studio engages, right? So I think about like identity, it's not who is in the studio, it's not only that, it's also who is your studio engaging. And I think that conversation has a lot more places it could go in the future.
Manju?
Hello. I was going to add to the infrastructure component, kind of highlight that technology, especially collaborative online platforms, can be a silent disruptor, but a very powerful and effective disruptor at the same time. And one of the, I think, often underlooked aspects is also, it's going back to Tony's comment about, thinking globally, but acting locally. So that multi-scalar operation, that's something that online platforms make possible kind of very easily, that we sometimes lose track of it. And also in terms of creating expansive knowledge communities where members can work asynchronously at various different time zones, don't have to actually meet in person. So expansive yet cohesive and convenient structures for collaboration and radical change. So I have included comments for Jessica in the document as well. So that's kind of my contribution to how we might think a little bit more about technology and kind of identify it as a crucial infrastructure.
Jean?
Yeah, just responding to Tommy Yang's comment in the document. I actually have been wondering if we should be calling what we're moving forward to architecture at all, because that has become such a loaded institutional term. And it was originally something that it already is multidisciplinary or interdisciplinary, supposedly. So is it a discipline in and of itself anyways?
Juliana?
I want to bring up a very down-to-earth point, and maybe I haven't been able to attend all the sessions, so if it's been already discussed, apologies. I really like the takeaway of building solidarities, but I would like us to be a bit more specific about solidarities with whom and how we do that. And the first thing that comes to mind for me is that, so most of us, I assume, speak from academia, right? Are somehow involved in academia. And in fact, that's a wonderful thing. I think what we're doing with ABC is a form of redistribution, right? The academia allows us the time and the resources to have these kinds of discussions. But academia also runs on exploited and cheapened academic labor. And I think a lot of us, some of us perhaps have tenure, but a lot of us probably teach studio at for very little compensation. And I think that is an important point of solidarity, because most lecturers form an already pre-existing class of people within architecture, but also in all disciplines and throughout academia, that are underpaid, and which allows the academia to run. And that is an easy solidarity to build, right? Our colleagues, lecturers across disciplines, across the university, and then from university to university. I think that's a component that for me is important and is very much on my mind.
Is there anyone else who'd like to go, or? Tony?
Yes, responding to Juliana, if I can. Juliana, thank you for your comments. Obviously, the easiest thing to do is to build solidarity with your colleagues. And I think you make a very fair point that many people working in architectural education are exploited in various ways. And no question that that's true. And that's the easy place to start building solidarity, because you have a common workplace with such people, you have common understandings of the environment you work in, common language. And clearly that should happen. But I would respectfully suggest that one other very useful place for building solidarity is with external communities, because most universities, most schools of architecture, on some level at least, will pay lip service to the idea that they have to respond to community concerns. Certainly in my country, most universities are publicly funded. And if one can build a community of people outside the architecture school, that is to say, the people who might be the consumers of architecture, the people who might benefit or be disadvantaged by it, then that forms a very powerful lobby group, I think, for argument within the university context. So yeah, by all means start by talking to your colleagues. But if you can expand that conversation to people who aren't architects, but who need architecture, and of course, poor people need architecture more than rich people, then I think you have the possibility of presenting quite a convincing argument to the university authorities, who will certainly resist any effort to change the way they deliver their programs, and certainly the amount of money that they pay the people who do that delivery.
Joshua?
Yeah, hi, I'm Josh Barnett in New York City. I actually wanted to build on the last 2 points. I thought they were really important. That I understand that this is mostly geared towards architectural education, and as somebody with a B.Arch, I get that, and having gone through the worst of bourgeois architecture, I get that, it really needs revamping. But I think that in terms of, this is the second ABC school I've been to, and I think that there's a lot of advances being made here in terms of breaking down the barriers between academia and, like they said, practice and the community. But I think it's possible to look at ways to make this even more inclusive than it's been. And the 2 things that came to my mind, having unfortunately only been able to attend a couple workshops, because I am working for the Housing Authority, is one, just the language that we use. I think that when you're really involved in academia, there is sort of a jargon that you can be heavily invested in, and that's very insular and more inward looking. And honestly, to me, words like pedagogy, practice, transsectional, they speak to us, not only don't they speak outside the community, they speak only to a slice of the community. And I think that if we did have, not that this shouldn't be academically oriented, not everything has to be universally appealing, but it should be universally understandable. And I think that if you do look at the language that is more universally understood, what words don't just speak to the academic community, I think that would send a political message of outreach that I think is really important. And in terms of actually who does, present at things like this, being involved in the fight for public housing, a lot of residents groups have a saying, nothing for us without us. And I think that that's also, probably true outside of New York City also, but I think that if you do invite like residents groups, like, I work with groups like the National Alliance of HUD Tenants and the Residents to Preserve Public Housing. And I think having people sit in on the workshops or even present at the workshops, or, we talk about the labor, speaking as an ex-construction worker, groups like the Labor Network for Sustainability and Trade Unions for Energy Democracy, they're mostly involved in things like just transition and fighting climate destruction, but also, bringing them to the table, bringing them as presenters, as inviters, would really, I think, serve. Once, we always say, at the Housing Authority, we would design very differently if the residents were sitting in on our design sessions and if we presented to them afterwards. And so having people involved in the process of both presenting and being at the workshops, I think, is a good way to break down what the last 2 speakers have been speaking about in terms of building solidarity by having them at the ABC itself. So just wanted to throw both of those things out.
Thomas?
Yeah, so I say this as a former dean and as a tenured professor. I think there is no way we are going to convince architecture schools to change. I think the profession and the academy is way too entrenched. And I think we need to be clear about what the potential is of what we're doing here. Some of you heard me say this in some of the sessions. I think our field needs a public health version of itself. And when you look at the rise of public health in the 19th century, it was started by a group of doctors who did not try to reform medical school. They just started to act out in the world, demonstrated the value of public health, and eventually public health schools emerged separate from medical schools. And I actually think that that's the potential in what we're doing here, which is that we need a public health version of our discipline. We're never going to get it by trying to convince traditional architectural academics or even the architectural profession to change any more than doctors were not initially convinced about public health. I think we need to use mechanisms like the ABC school, like Dark Matter University, these other mechanisms to start doing kind of public interest design work out in the world, demonstrate the value of what it is we're doing, get other students, many of whom are here, interested in doing more of this work, and then talk about starting another field, a parallel field to architecture, because I agree, I don't think what we're doing, I think it's way more than architecture. I don't even think we should potentially even use the word architecture any more than public health doesn't use the word medicine. So anyway, that's what I see as a great potential in what's going on here.
Tony?
Thomas, thank you. Thomas has covered my point better than I could have done. You can't shift, I think, what's happening within an established architecture school. You may be able to create little moments of resistance within the programs that are under your control. The fundamental structure is not likely to change. What we can do differently is we can operate differently as individuals, both in the architecture school where we have the scope to do that, and in the community. And I guess that's why I keep hammering this thing about being a citizen. Architects are just citizens with particular skill sets. And if you bring those to bear on your community when you're practicing, then that may be the biggest impact that you can have, you and your colleagues.
Peggy?
I want to say I'm inspired by what Tom was suggesting. But I wanted to just comment on Joshua's very, very good points. And maybe this is an apology or a request for change, but when we chose studio for this theme, I think we knew that we were talking academia. There definitely were discussions about studio can happen within a practice, and there are certain practices that have their own schools, that there is a tangent that is an academic. But I think we were worried about and conscious of the fact that this one in a specificity was academic. But that, I know, is no reason to not hear larger non-academic voices about what we think studio is. But my point is that I think part of what you're bringing up, or that we're all bringing up, is what is the next version of the ABC school? What is it that would actually make it not academic? I think it certainly is one of the action items, the larger action items that I hope comes out of not just this week and not just the discussion now, but propelling this to the future. What's the next one? Studio was in some way an indication that we were broad last time and we need to get specific. What exactly is necessary after this very specific and probably way too academic thing?
Manju?
I just want to make clear that I'm kind of going to be taking us back to Tom and Tony's comments, so it's not a direct response to Peggy. But I'm just intrigued by the suggestion of having a new discipline. And it's also, I'm thinking about the historic development of a field called environment behavior studies and even environmental psychology, which in the 70s and 80s came about kind of similar concerns that we have been discussing this week. And I assume the lobby has been doing about at least 2 years now. Concerns about the field needing to be interdisciplinary, having to participatory engagement with end users, and so on and so forth. So I am just curious to know that if we should actually maybe just look not too far into the past, but maybe just at the turn of the 60s or 70s, when we had a lot of reawakenings within US academia about disciplines and new ones. So maybe pay attention to environment behavior studies and environmental psychology, which had the same questions we are addressing today.
Ken?
Well, thank you very much. So I am inspired by what Thomas Fisher and Tony started. So this basically this public interest design work teaching. But I also want to think in the context of this, well, maybe it was about 30 years ago, many architecture schools, not all, but many architecture schools in the United States started moving the professional education to graduate level. So MArch professional education. And for many leading universities, again, not all, but many leading universities, graduate MArch became the flagship program, right? And that actually opened a very large field in undergraduate education. And I really would like to discuss, actually, especially with this group, if we can, what is happening there. So what sorts of courses are being offered by us, other educators at the undergraduate level? I'm sure those of you who teach like in those programs, but also in MArch, you know that actually there's huge inequality among basically levels and intellectual level of students coming to graduate programs. It depends a lot on the quality of their undergraduate education. But also, can we use basically that undergraduate education for educating citizens, not necessarily the future architects as well? And how can we do that? Can we, again, along the line of what Tom and Tony were talking, can we turn that into a public interest design education? Can we construct a cross-listed curriculum of social equality, social justice, where architecture become the catalyst for not future architects, but for everyone? So what do you think?
Lara?
I think Tessa wants to give a response to Ken, so if she wants to.
I was just going to say that I think that's just such a great point. Like we really have focused a lot on accreditation requirements, and it would be actually really interesting to look maybe more in depth at the programs that where accreditation is not important, and what kind of strategies are being used there. So yeah, just wanted to kind of plus on that. And I know that that's a big focus at the school that I teach at, that our undergraduate program, we're like actually not particularly interested in professional requirements. So it does make for, I think, kind of quite a rich program. Thanks, Lara.
Back to Lara.
Okay. I was going to comment on a few things, but I can start with Thomas again. On one of the last workshops we were together, I told you about there was a few people there, but here we have different people. So I will tell a little bit about this. Again, in Brazil, we have this public architecture thing, like this is a law but it's really hard to make use of it. So it is possible, people. It takes time. I think it started on the 80s probably, and we had a new constitution. We were just coming out from a dictatorship of 20 plus years. So it was a moment of a lot of democracy and discussion. So a lot of things started in the 80s, in the end of the 80s here. And this was one thing that after, I don't know, it was approved, the final law was approved in 2008. So it took a little bit of time to finally be something official, but it is something that we have here, but it also has its challenges, like to actually use this to access, like to give access to people that usually wouldn't have access to architecture work or something like that. So I don't know, it's more encouragement to you that we're excited about the idea. We also have, like, before we had the public architecture office, we also had this kind of public lawyer office. So those are things like we have health, like public health system, we have public health system, and we have this public lawyers work, and we also have architecture. So those are kind of, I don't know, maybe it means something for you. So those kind of professions. And before that, I was going to talk about the infrastructure. That's something that came up on other discussions, not this week, but with different people, about laboratories. Like we have all this discussion about having labor going through the education of architects during undergrad studies. But sometimes we don't have like the infrastructure for laboratories to have not only computers, but also to learn some trades that are usually associated with the architect's profession. So we would have access to learn a little bit more about, I don't know, working with wood, and like carpenters that would be working with us, maybe in developing some of the exercise, some of the studio activities and yielding, or anyway, this kind of activities. That was something that some people, I don't know if it's not common to have, because it takes money to have this kind of infrastructure, but it's something that was really important, at least for me during my education, was really important to have this kind of laboratory. The technicians there were, I don't know, probably two of the best professors I had during my years of undergrad student. So I was going to point this out, that maybe we can discuss something like that on a next opportunity. And Juliana was talking about this underpayment for professors, and I couldn't not relate to underpayment for researchers. Well, I don't know, I think maybe that's something that happens around the world too, or I don't know, it's something here that we have here, a problem we have here in Brazil, that is not having funds to pay for researchers. So we basically work on a free labor basis, and we have to produce, we have to publicize our researchers, our research in academic journals, etc. And it's a lot of money that usually we have to pay for publish and not get paid. And finally, Joshua was talking about using proper language, and that's something I struggle, because I don't use the proper language for academic means, and I don't dress in a proper manner. I don't walk, I don't talk, I don't have the things to be an architect in academic area, academic, I don't know, environment. And I don't know, probably I won't be a professor in a public university because of that, because it's like you're less than we expect you to be. But I really am proud of having these traces, because I can, at least from my experience, I can communicate with communities much easier and much better than some of this academic approved people. That was it for my comments. Thank you.
Tony?
Yeah, a couple of points. I wanted to pick up on Can's comments about what's happening in undergraduate non-professional programs. And it's not difficult to believe that the accreditation process, which normalizes architectural education, is fundamentally pernicious. I actually think it'd be a much better model if all architecture programs at undergraduate and postgraduate level were free of accreditation protocols, or at least could be free of accreditation protocols, and you protect the public at the registration level. When somebody wants to become a registered architect in practice, that's when you institute various protocols to make sure that they're competent. I think if there was more diversity in architectural education, it would be a better thing. And I do remember hearing stories, perhaps from 20 years ago now, that if you took the whole of the European Union, excluding Italy, there were 70,000 architecture students, but there were 60,000 in Italy. And what you end up with is a vast population of design literate people who become the consumers of architecture and fashion and automobiles and motorcycles and everything else that needs to be well designed. But most of those people don't procure an architectural education with the intention of becoming registered architects or certified architects. They do it because they're interested in design and developing that literacy. So I would certainly think that that would be useful. One other quite different point that I want to respond to that was raised in conversation: how can one subvert the establishment schools? As Thomas quite properly said, that's a big ask. But one small way you can do it is by getting Indigenous people to run programs in your school, or professionals from Indigenous groups to run programs in your schools. Because in my experience, all the schools want to do that because it's a good look. And those people from those Indigenous communities often run their schools, their programs, completely differently from the normal model. And because they're working from a cultural platform which is unchallengeable in many parts of the world now, they can get away with doing things differently. And that's beneficial for everyone. So that breaks the normalizing mold of the traditional architecture school and the way it operates. It's not enough to subvert the whole structure, but it is a point of difference that's worth having, I think.
Jean?
Oh yeah, sorry, I'm going to keep my video off. I just moved into my kitchen. I was thinking about the student perspective in the institution. So for me as a grad student, if I want to keep the funding to stay in school, I have to take the classes in my program, and to get back to school after having a BA, I have to apply to be a part of a program. So I think if you're trying to empower students to be able to take the classes they want or learn what they want in some way, then we're not figuring out a way to offer that separately. The institution definitely has to be influenced to provide some wiggle room, because I do not have much wiggle room for like an elective.
Thomas?
Yeah, I'm going to sort of change direction a little bit. So I don't think we have to do this alone. I think there are some very powerful partners that we could leverage to do this work. 2 weeks ago, I was at a meeting that the UN called with 19 different countries, talking about how do we actually get the Sustainable Development Goals implemented at what they call a subnational level. The UN is frustrated that the SDGs remain at a kind of a national level, and while they recognize the action really happens on the ground. And so I was representing universities there and made the case that universities in many countries are frequently some of the most stable institutions, certainly the ones that could help the implementation of the SDGs. And as I think about the ABC School, the Architecture Lobby, and I think about the things we're talking about right now, I think that one thought would be to stop trying to reform architecture schools, which I don't think are reformable, and simply to begin to partner with other entities, not just the UN, but also large foundations that want to see this work happening. When I was meeting there, the Kellogg Foundation was there. There were big primarily US foundations wanting to fund this work. And so I think that, again, instead of us complaining about the situations we all face in architectural education, is let's think about going in a very different direction, find powerful partners that have funding to actually enable us to do this work. And I actually think, they would be very open and receptive to entrees by us to the kinds of things that they're trying to do. So I just put that out there.
Rebecca, would you like to go, or?
Hi, hello. No, I just posted some comments on the chat. I was aligning with many of you. I don't know, my general opinion is that someone also during my workshop with Monica and Renzo proposed to build a completely new school of architecture that has different ideologies and theories. I don't know, as we said also between the three of us, I'd rather go for a way of infiltrating the system, of influencing and creating infrastructure that can do that. So perhaps what Tom was just saying would be a way. I don't know. Also, I like this idea of the indigenous, of having someone external giving feedback, giving courses, giving opinions, or lecturing it, or also even someone posted the idea of having a reviewers board. I think this is already happening somehow in some schools. I mean, at KU Leuven, where I'm a PhD student at the moment, they are building up a diversity board, but what I find problematic is that the diversity board is run by the vice dean. So perhaps she has the best intention, but how can we change the system if the people in charge of these reviewers review board are people from the system? So to have someone from to collaborate with externals, or I don't know, to get these infiltrations, this is what I'm suggesting here.
Monica?
Hi, everybody. I want to ask a question regarding this theme of architecture schools not being reformable and linking up with other powerful actors and allies. And we're talking a lot about the system in the US. And I want to pose this question for non-US participants in this chat, and particularly if there's anybody from Germany, for example, where the Architektenkammer, or the Architects Association, is heavily infiltrated by construction lobbies and various other actors, but they would have this sort of financial power and the reach to support action like that? Or is that entrenched in this theme of non-reformable entities that act against the interests of architectural labor, the way we talk about it here?
Peggy?
I think that's a really good question, Monica, and it makes me think about one way of thinking about where the ABC school goes, because we had thought that before this was going to be studio, we were actually going to be thinking about working with San Diego and their particular situation of a Zob school, inventing a new school, and what could be a better, real concrete example of how one actually thinks a new school in a local situation, and then learn from that local situation, and then next year bring it to another place that would not be the United States. And so it's interesting to think about that and think about how important it is, and basically around the point that you're making, which is we tend to think about our own institutions and how to break out of our institutions, and we need to learn how to redefine them completely. But just to go back to Tom's point, I want to emphasize how helpful it is to have discussions like this, because I do think in the lobby, we have thought of ourselves as out of any funding opportunity. We're out of funding opportunities because architecture foundations want to know about environmentalism, new technologies, AI, and new forms. And so we're out of that. And they're certainly not going to fund something that's trying to say we hate the whole system because they're supporting the system. Nor are we ever going to get funding from non-architectures because architecture is an elitist thing, and why do we have problems when, you know, we know the problems are greater. And so like, we're just out of the ballpark. So you're saying that, you know, makes me think that that's an indication of small thinking, you know, or we're just too embedded in our little own conversations. You know, the once you don't say architect, you know, and say, you know, spatial community activist, or, you know, I don't know what it is, we could get the attention of those people you're suggesting we get attention from.
Jessica?
Yeah, there's so much to respond to now that I'm at this part in stack. Yes, I think, you know, what Joshua was bringing up about forming solidarities with certain like grassroots organizations, I think that's really phenomenal. I get a little apprehensive about large grants with large U.S. institutions. I think many times some of the question is about like certain technologies. How can something be militarized, right? is a huge question, and many times the underlying aspect of some of the grants that are being granted. The current institution I just left, we had a Wokini initiative. I'm in South Dakota. We're among 9 Lakota, Dakota, Nakota nations. And the Wokini initiative was a way to bring in indigenous ideas. And I find that many times what happens with these initiatives is that they're very much individualized and not collective. So this even happens in schools of architecture where it's like, hey, we'll have a class on indigenous architecture. That's it. I think what Kathy and Amanda were presenting was really amazing because it was breaking out an entire curriculum built around indigenous perspectives. But back to this Wokini initiative, it was a grant that was based around working with Lakota students. And many times what happens is that the researchers would just take their research and say, and we're going to do this in Lakota communities. And I think that there's this ongoing joke that like we have coming from those communities. And I think Vine Deloria Jr., who's this really fantastic Lakota writer, had said it best, had a whole chapter on this about how to spot an anthropologist. Sorry, anthropologists in the group. But it was this really fantastic chapter, which was talking about the use of communities for research methods and how that sometimes becomes perpetuated, or how many times the institution, including architecture schools, given certain research demands, will place these odd expectations on individual professors to put forth an agenda. And what that ends up doing is then we become very exploitative to certain communities. So architecture can be very violent within these communities. And I think that it's been recognized. I like Josh's point because there are already several action-based initiatives that are happening on the ground. And so I think rather sometimes than thinking about how do we create our own meetings, our own organizations around this, how do we support those, right? How do we not just like tap into them, but also support what others are doing, not necessarily in a way to support our own selves, but just to support others in that. And I think that's, you know, Juliana's question about who are we building solidarity with? It's important, right? Because oftentimes I think that it's something that is about maybe demonstrating expertise rather than supporting through solidarity.
Tessa, you're up next.
Yeah, I agree with a lot of what Jessica was saying, and similarly, there's so many things to respond to now. Yeah, I think I had a kind of almost visceral reaction to partnering with large foundations, US foundations, particularly, and I don't know, kind of responding to, I think it was Rebecca who was talking about outside of the US. It seemed, my understanding of perhaps Germany is that there's actually a lot more kind of public funding for grassroots action, whereas in New Zealand, there's basically none for architecture. And so this kind of capacity to sort of break away from the institution becomes increasingly difficult. And there are ways of doing it. There's a practice, an Indigenous practice in Northland and in New Zealand that did get a large foundation, and they work with children, and children do all their concept design for them, and then they realize those designs, and then they pay young people to kind of come through their practice as interns, and they teach them design skills through that process. But other than that, there's almost no opportunity for that. And so I think that figuring out ways to kind of challenge or resist within our institution is still valid. And I think we can do both. And I don't think it's one or the other. This kind of like, I think that figuring out how to resist the system or resist institutions will support or will give us the kind of tools to then, if we are in a kind of position to work outside of the institution, we'll have a kind of bigger, broader set of skills. Well, you know, so anyway, I just think like we should be resisting all the time, not just waiting until we've got the opportunity to kind of, you know, burn everything down and rebuild.
Anyone else would like to go?
I
Juliana?
think Manuel had quite an interesting question in there too.
I'll let Manuel go if he wants. I'll go afterwards.
Go ahead, Juliana.
Okay, I didn't mean to put you on the spot. So I'm, maybe I misunderstood Tom's point about large foundations, but I'm still processing the idea. I'm an architectural historian, and I spend a lot of time reading my colleagues' work on how foundations in the past, such as the Ford Foundation, the Rockefeller Foundation, partnered with architects, or rather architects partnered with them in the 60s and in the 70s with very, very good intentions, and ended up advancing a colonial extractive ideology for those foundations. So I don't, under the aegis of the World Bank, by the way, which is another one of these sort of well-meaning large institutions. So this is to say that I'm not an apologist of academia, but I think academia affords us a structure that at least intends to be democratic and transparent, at least in its mission, right? It might not hold up to that, but we should. And working with foundations might not give us the same amount of agency. We end up doing the bidding of those missions, of the foundation's mission or of the UN's. Anyway, I think what I'm saying is it is very provocative, but I am a student of history and therefore approach it with some amount of skepticism.
I guess back to Manuel.
I don't really have anything else to say. I agree a little bit with what Juliana just added. I think that we have to be very critical of philanthrocapitalism, and I do think that doing a lot of things is very important and doing things in many directions, but it also seems like a way of very easily becoming co-opted. I'm in a university where there's a lot of money for research, it's like embarrassing how much money there is, because it's tied to the military industrial complex. And so I guess, yeah, you have to kind of be careful who you're getting in bed with, you know. That's my feeling, but I'm not against, like, I was actually wondering whether the next ABC school should be about grant writing, and how, you know, in what way do you create ways of getting money for these more ambitious framings that we have been discussing around incorporating communities, and I don't know. But this question around what are the conditions of work in our workplaces, both in academia and outside academia, and what type of leverage do we have through unions or through other forms of disruption or change, I think is very important not to lose sight of that, personally.
Peggy?
This is a totally interesting conversation, and I just wanted to very directly answer the question that Manuel had posed about whether the architecture lobby, besides making efforts to unionize practices, or making efforts to unionize within the academy, and the answer is no. And it's a totally good question. I think it goes to the critique that's coming up here of our kind of, on the one hand, privileged status, where us academics, you know, tenured or non-tenured, would say, let's unionize our department. But you know, so it comes from a certain elitism, but also comes from a real insecurity that we in fact know we don't have any power. But I just want to say that I think it's a very, very provocative question for us to consider. And it is in some way put our money as academics where our mouth is here. So just to say that.
Natalie? This is still on the question in the chat, and I might read that out loud. Peggy, it's the question you just answered, but I might read it out to the group.
Right, yeah.
It was wondering what people think about the role of the academia working group in ABC School in relation to unionizing campaigns within practices in universities. Do we have a role to play? If so, how? Peggy, you said no, but I would say yes.
It was really quiet for a moment.
Yes. So the question is, I'm wondering what people think about the role of the academia working group in the ABC School in relationship to unionizing campaigns within practices in universities. Do we have a role to play in these campaigns? If so, how? And again,
we have a role.
Yes, we do have a role to play. I maybe I misinterpreted how Peggy answered that, but you know, okay, starting from the top, to me, I'm asking a lot of questions about, you know, okay, where is the academia working group going next? Where is the ABC School going next, right? This is already a very, very different kind of method that we tried this year versus last year, right? And I think I anticipate the same if we do this in the future. You know, that this needs to be, you know, right, actively different. And I think that's good because we learn different things that way, et cetera. But one of the questions or things I've been thinking about is that the academia working group should be doing more with ongoing efforts out of schools right now. I mean, so the Architecture Lobby, our last members meeting, we actually invited students who were organizing at South Dakota State University and at Bartlett and at SciArc, and had some really wonderful conversations with those students. And a lot of them were scared to come talk to us, but agreed based on we're not talking to media, we're not talking to journalists, right? This is here because we think that the methods you all used as students to organize within your universities should be shared, right? Like, and used as how can other, you know, educators, how can other students, how can other academics
learn from these movements that are happening. And I'd say, yes, I'd love to see our group, you know, like playing into that more and offering support, right? Thinking, how can we support these types of institutions that are undergoing these types of like internal kind of dialogues and uprisings, right? Which I am excited about. Yes, yes, and yes. And that's one way I see it. But you know, the other thing is you don't want to be going to students who are already in the pits of it, right? Doing the work and saying like, teach us what you got, right? So, you know, I think it's a careful balance there. And how do we engage it as an organization? How do we engage as this ABC school cohort? Those might be two different questions. But I think it's a great ask. And I think, yeah, we do have a role. You know, I actually think that does tie into this ongoing conversation about, can we reform schools? Do we need to like start our own alternatives? I mean, I would say, I don't know. I'm the type of person who's like, well, let's at least try, you know, like these schools are having these upheavals, right? So what can we do to take that momentum and utilize it? You know, why like throw that away to the side? I mean, it's happening and it's happening now. It's happening in the past couple of months, right? So like, if we're gonna do it, we need to do something and we need to act now and we need to act on the energy that's already taking place and already happening, right? I'd like to say like, let's you know, start some fights like first before saying that it's not possible. You know, and then I have this question of like, why would we look to the UN or any other large governing body as a better partner, you know, if we're already saying fuck these other large, you know, governing bodies, right? So that doesn't make any sense to me. All right, that's it. Okay, now I'm done.
Kadambari?
Yes, hi. This is a fascinating discussion, so much to discuss, but I just wanted to address or think with you all about the unionization question, because I think that it's an important one. I think one of the things, and I've also been involved with the ABC school for the last 2 years, and what has been wonderful for me personally to see is this sort of a international participation in the ABC school. And I guess my sort of, let's say, pitch here, the way the academic working group has been working and has worked so far, if you really feel strongly about an issue, then, you know, form a group and, you know, start. There are lots of people who are really interested in, as I said earlier, quote unquote, organizing. And it's been a really, really wonderful, rewarding experience to actually really learn about this issue, about various issues. And unionization, I think there's definitely a very strong interest in that. There's also, just to say one more thing about this, that from my perspective, I think it's interesting to also build on this sort of international conversation around this. I would say, I would even go far to say internationalist, if you like, just because I think that what we need for this is lots of examples, like what happens in other countries. Also, like thinking about, you know, public universities, that's a separate issue, but how education is funded in other countries, you know, is obviously very different than the US model. I think in terms of unionization, I have personally gotten a lot of, you know, interest in this. So just getting kind of examples, for example, in Germany, like the working conditions, you know, the architects, you know, have to pay their intern. It's written in the laws, right? It's the, so, you know, we can collect a lot of examples that sort of start addressing issues, you know, about working conditions or unionizations, but I think it's great to have potentially examples that we can refer to that are really, that can be built on the ABC kind of global participation. So anyway, just to throw that out there.
Monica, you have something in response to what Kadambari just said?
Yeah, I want to add something to the fact it might be said in the law that German architects have to pay their interns, but they don't. The architects' chambers and the architectural associations are doing almost nothing to ensure fair working conditions for architects in practices, and they're doing almost nothing to ensure fair working conditions for architecture, for working and construction labor. Everything is rife with hypocrisy and corruption. And I just wanted to clear that out because sometimes Germany is being seen, and especially South Germany, where I am, as this epitome of fair labor practices, and they're just hiding their toxic and their predatory practices better. No, I know a lot of people who didn't get paid. I worked 100-hour weeks in a big southern office, and I never saw a cent. It's never enforced. That's just what I wanted to add.
Lara?
I was actually make a stupid question, like how is it that you organize in your countries? Like, I know that you have AIA, but like here we have a lot of different federations and associations for different groups, like students organize themselves in federation, a national one. We have regional meetings, we have national meetings, we have Latin American meetings as students, and we have academic events to discuss teaching, education. And I know that depending on your class, let's say, like if you have an office, you have an association of officers. If you have, I don't know, anyway, you have different instances. So there are many other people that can kind of be part of these discussions. Like when you were wondering about the UN, I wouldn't be that far because we have so many other people in our own bubble, let's say, that can be addressed first, like can be included in this discussion first, like the grassroots movements that we also have a lot of contact with when we go to this outreach ways of acting. And I was actually going to be the the one to ask for people that are debating on chat that it's really hard to do both things, like to follow people talking and then follow the huge texts and trying to accompany the Google Docs, like too much happening.
Juliana?
I'm very grateful for the discussion about unionization, and I think ABC can help. I'm involved with one unionization effort right now, and it is very down in the weeds. It happens, it's a very local effort. It's a lot of one-on-one conversations, very specific to a particular working environment. And what we need but don't have the capacity for, because we're so in the trenches, is a kind of clearinghouse where we would know about other similar efforts that are ongoing. We don't have time to do that research, but if we could ask, hey, ABC, we're doing this, who else is doing this? Can we talk to them? That would be tremendous, and that would make everybody stronger, and that would be a very concrete example of solidarities.
Andrea?
I just wanted to say that I'm part of an institution that is unionized, but the union actually argues for compensation that is far less than what it should be. It's actually quite unsatisfactory. And it's very difficult to encourage any sort of boldness within those existing institutions. And so I actually think one of the larger questions when it comes to unionization is which unions are actually being bold and putting forward ideas that are actually going to help and or should we be starting to set up unions that are beyond what are already existing?
Anyone else? Natalie?
I have an idea. I was just trying to catch up in the chat and reading about Miriam's comment that something that would be helpful is an open source digital source of ABC teaching and practice. And my suggestion or offer to the group, we could do that. And so if you attended the open source workshop session, Will Martin started talking about some things like GitHub, but essentially it's a repository. And I don't know how familiar everybody here is with working with repositories. It's really common in like computer science or fields that are working with big data. And like we use one in my research lab, we use another one, it's called Bitbucket, but it's the same concept, same thing. But what they're great at is allowing for the sharing of resources and like track changes on resources. You know, I almost like, I know we have like our resources pages in Luma with, you know, some kind of articles here or there, but I almost like want to start a repository for us as like an ABC school cohort, just as a starting place for people to build documents together, perhaps, or like put in examples or things that our schools are doing. Just a thought about the open source stuff. Like, I think like we could do that. We could start trying to do something like that with our group itself, if that'd be helpful.
Miriam? Miriam, are you there?
Sorry, just give me a second. Sorry, I realized you couldn't hear me without my headphones on. Apologies. Can you hear me? Okay, great. No, I just had 2 points. One was the comment about the sharing resources, and I was thinking like of it amongst a group of academics, but also more widely. I thought about the kind of impact that spatial agency, that website had on our students to see models of practice and models of form, like so many different forms of working. And I'm sure most people are aware of that, but that's been a really impactful website that I can see its lineage in the last 10 years been really effective at pointing out modes of practice, modes of teaching, ways of operating in the world that are not specifically, yeah, sorry, I'll put it in the chat. That was one thing about the open resources. I was thinking as a very much a public face rather than something internally for a group of academics, which would also be useful, but that the kind of public face of this is helpful. And then the second comment was about the kind of reservations about involving groups like the UN or using groups like the UN. But I'd made a comment as well on the document that in our institution, we've recently, across all the schools of architecture in the Republic of Ireland, got funding to change our curriculum in line with the SDGs. And this has been a really kind of quite a dramatic shift. And it's creating pressure on our accreditation boards, it's on our professional bodies, so that there is an impact, I think, that can be positive. It doesn't mean that we have to subscribe to everything, but it's a different type of pressure than what's normally brought to bear, which are commercial pressures on the accreditation board or professional body. So I see it as being something that has potentially positive outcome. We're still at the start of that process, but I think I absolutely see the need for kind of grassroots activism, collaborations, but I also think leveraging things like the UN SDGs can also help with policies at government level, and in my case at European level, that are trying to meet climate targets and ambitions and ways to deliver on those. So we're kind of seeing that this might be a useful other way into changing the curriculum, which is not about changing the curriculum from within the construction industry or whatever. So it's in our case might be a useful alternative route to curriculum change. That was all. Thank you.
Andrea?
So I think it might be time to start shifting towards concluding. And by concluding, what we really mean is starting to figure out ways to continue this conversation over a much longer period of time. And I think we've got a few ideas for how to do that. And I'm going to turn the floor over to Natalie to start that conversation.
Yeah. I first will start by saying thank you to everyone who hosted a session this week, moderated a session this week, came to a session this week, planned a session this week. I think, it's kind of amazing for those of us who have been working to organize it to see how successful of a week this was. And I hate using that word successful, but like, I guess by that, I mean, it happened, right? And it happens. And we brought people together who didn't know each other, and we shared ideas internationally, and I apologize. I think for me, with my talk, I still speak about like my Western kind of upbringing and standards. I think I'm going to do a better job in the future of acknowledging, that type of a demographic and representation we have here. But so that's that. Thank you a lot for being here. I hope that this felt less, as we were planning it, we were like, this kind of feels like a conference, but it's like, we don't want to really be a conference, so I hope it felt more collaborative than that, and hopefully more idea generating than that. Hopefully this felt more like a week of ideation and kind of collaboration building than anything else. And I do think that part of this conversation should be how are we all staying in touch, and how would we like to move forward? So with that, I can talk briefly about the academia working group and the architecture lobby, and then from there I'll open it up to others' thoughts about what's next, because this is our last officially scheduled time together as of the moment. So for the academia working group, so this is a group where some of us are lobby members, some of us aren't, but it's open to all. And in the past like 8 months, we've been meeting every 10 days to make sure that this week was planned. But the meeting schedule and frequency may be changing, but we alternate kind of who hosts and facilitates and plans these meetings each time. So it's never the same person who is putting the Zoom together and the agenda together, which is kind of nice. We take turns with that responsibility. We will be meeting, I think just putting it in the chat, we'll be meeting, our next meeting as an academia group will be on August 4th. So August 4th, 2022 at 6 p.m. EST, and they typically run an hour and a half. There's questions in the chat that I'll try to just answer right now. So can we join those sessions? Yes, please. This is our invitation. We're asking you all, please come if you want to come. And let's see. Yes, 6 to 7:30 EST, starting Thursday, August 4th. And how open is it in terms of commitment? I think, so I've been a part of the working group for 2 years, and in that time, it's fluctuated on who is like around all the time, and who is kind of taking breaks and things like that. I think it's been really nice to see how the demographic of our working group even has kind of, evolved itself. but I think it's a, yeah, the commitment is what you would like it to be. I think as the months where we're planning events and things like that, you know, can be heavier, but you can also choose, hey, I want to come to the meetings, but I can't help with, you know, coordinating whatever this work is that's happening, right? It's up to you. I told the group today, I'm like, I need to take most of August off because I have too much happening in my personal life, you know, and that's totally okay. It's fine if we'd love to have you there whenever you're able to be there or would like to be there. So Andrea put the email in the chat. It's abc@architecturelobby.org. And then I want to do a plug before I'm opening this up. I want to do a plug for the Architecture Lobby itself. A lot of the themes we talked about today are things that the Architecture Lobby does dive into kind of individually on its own basis. So like, for instance, I'll go back to the question about unionization. We do have a group of folks very similar to the academia working group that is solely focused on unionizing efforts within practices and schools. So if you're like, hey, loved this, but I really want to talk about unionizing, right, and put my effort there, I encourage you to first of all, join the lobby. Second of all, you know, step into a working group that does meet kind of more specifically that interest. We have other ones that are on racial justice, the Green New Deal. We are currently starting like a video series in a way that will be interviewing workers in the architectural field and trying to help share and highlight these worker narratives within architecture. So there's a group that's working on that. We're in the process of completely revamping our website, so stay tuned on that. Hopefully it'll be great. But you know, here's the spiel I was told to say. We are a member-driven organization of several hundred architectural workers, democratically and transparently organized, fighting for a left vision of the field. And we have city chapters across the country and internationally as well. So there are likely people in your area who also support the same types of things that you think about, you know, and it's great to form some connections to geographically. I really hope one day to meet a lot of you that are on this call, not through Zoom. That'd be cool. A plug on that too is that if you're in Ann Arbor, Michigan, a couple of us are meeting up tonight, you know, so get in touch with me. If you have people in your area that you met, right, like get in touch with them. Where can we find tasks to volunteer on? I would say the best thing to do would just be to come to a meeting. Oftentimes after a meeting, we send out like a recap. So it'll have the agenda, it'll have meeting minutes, and it'll have here's like kind of action items, things to do, things that people are working on. All right, I'm going to stop there and I'll turn to you, Peggy, for Stack, and then I think Andrea after that.
I just wanted to emphasize how completely organic these meetings are. And it is the case that generally what happens with a working group like this or a campaign is 25 people come, and then the next time 15 people come, and the next time 10 people come, and then all of a sudden you have the 6 people are really doing it. But how those 6 people emerge is completely up to your interests, your skills, and whatever. And even if in that picture, people will come for one meeting and then not come again, but inevitably those people who come for one meeting make us think about things that we should be thinking about. And so there's no too much or too little in any of this. It's really a space where everyone can share their concerns and their interests. Personally, I am imagining that there are going to be different committees that will form within the academia working group, just because I think there is so much that's come out of this particular week, and people will be interested in different things, whether it's doing the theme for next year or internationalizing or or thinking about how new technologies become a form of advocacy. I think there will be a place for everybody. And just to say again, this is all volunteer. The more there are, the less those of us who are here are going to burn out, just to say.
The thing that I wanted to add was that I think this is one of the few organizations that I've been part of that is actually truly trying to prototype a community of care. So what that means to me is that we accept people where they are, right? Like where they are. And so as Peggy was saying, if you just want to come in and sort of drop a few tidbits of wisdom, fantastic. We're excited about it. And if you want to dedicate more time, that's also a huge part of this. So, and again, the more of you there are, the less individual load that there is. And we do have to as a community of care, try and find ways of distributing this so that we aren't burning out, because there is a lot to do. So that's it.
So maybe we can open it. There are 5 minutes left. If there are other ways people would like to engage, whether this is suggestions for like the academia working group, or whether this is something you want to do outside of like a working group type of effort, I'd love to hear people's thoughts on that.
Hey, Natalie, I totally like glazed out when you said that. Can you say what you said again?
Yeah, I want to hear from folks if they have other ideas outside of the academia working group, ways for keeping this going. I'd love to hear others' ideas, or kind of if you have a promise you want to make to yourself, like, hey, I want to get together with people in my area and talk about XYZ, and you already are thinking about that, like maybe sharing that would be fun.
Since no, oh, go ahead.
Andrea?
Yeah, I just wanted to answer the question about Luma, which it will remain active. I'm also thinking we've got this fantastic document. Everyone's throwing stuff into it. Let's keep throwing stuff into it. I think one of the big projects that we'll take on first when we meet on August 4th is synthesizing this and trying to find like real working points that we can continue to push forward. So this, you're already like well on your way to being part of that group.
Peggy, I think our current members can probably set up the agenda. That way our new members aren't having to do that task, but we can talk via email perhaps about who's going to coordinate August 4th.
But please make suggestions, because I think Peggy and I will be coordinating the agenda. And so if there's any suggestions, we can plug it into it.
Yeah, often we'll send an agenda link out and then invite edits, and people are welcome to edit the document directly.
Yeah, I want to emphasize how inclusive it was. I was thinking about this thing for a while, and then when my semester ended, I just hopped on the organizational chain, and they immediately sent me the link and invited me to all the Google Docs. I had editing power from day one.
Maybe this really is the time to say goodbye, and thank you to everybody at every single level. So unbelievably helpful. I know I'm going to be forever indebted to my co-organizers. I just want to say that. But this has been just an amazing experience for me and for all of us. So thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Bye.
Thank you, people. It was really great. I'm going to miss you all after a week together. Not you, Will. I will see you on Monday. Not
Great.
Will Thompson. There are other Wills here. Bye.
Bye.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.